Okay, all right. So here we are. Chapters 8 through 15 of Leviticus. I know you're just chomping at the bit, ready to jump into this, all nerd style. So, are there any questions from last week? If you had a chance to kind of go home and through the week, amidst all the busyness and whatnot, digest some of what we talked about? Did it inspire any questions, stir any curiosity in the back of your mind, things that might need to be clarified before we move on and build on that?
I will say, you were using washed and sprinkled. Which one did you mean? Because if you're saying if it's really said sprinkled, why is it, on your little diagram of washed, blah, blah, blah. Because you want to say, it's not really washed, you're sprinkled, but then you kept going back and forth with it.
So because I don't have that PowerPoint presentation pulled up, I can't say exactly in reference to your question what that would look like. I will say on the far left side of that slide, the idea was trying to capture the New Testament term that is used and then seeing how that connects back to the Levitical speech, since Leviticus is where most of this stuff is kind of corralled. We've seen some of it already introduced before Leviticus in the back half of Exodus, and then of course it gets kind of reiterated in the front 10 chapters of Numbers, but most of it's being spoken of there or used there. And so just to connect those points in our mind so that we're thinking outside the box of what typically most of us are raised with and or influenced by when we read those terms strictly in a New Testament context, we're thinking about the idea of, again, Christian hymnody and the idea of being washed in Jesus' blood, which is not unbiblical in any way. We see that as an image given to us by John in the Apocalypse. However, that in and of itself is different in that context than what we think as goes the average sinner's experience in us coming to Christ, because that act of personal salvation from an individual all the way up to a corporate stance is being described by men like Peter and Paul using those types of words and putting it against that Levitical backdrop to help us understand. In that frame of reference, Jesus' sacrifice being far superior to what was being offered by any of them, not just simply because of the fact he's God incarnated in human flesh, but also because of the effectiveness of his sacrifice, what it could do that those sacrifices were not allowed by law to do and never intended to do. But that aside, it's not just the sense of the personal or the sinner experiencing personal atonement or anything like that. It's the idea of the corporate concept of God's people dwelling with him in sacred space and how that concept is pictured for us, and the allowance, which is what we're going to kind of get into tonight a little bit more of, how we're allowed to even enter sacred space. So that concept then gets brought over to the New Testament and speaking about with the language of us being the new temple, both on an individual and a corporate level, because Paul speaks of us being a temple of the Holy Spirit, but then Peter speaks of us all being living stones that form a much larger construct. So with that idea in mind, the concept of sacred space, God dwelling or filling in that sacred space, his people meeting with him, is not in any way lost. It's just somehow clarified. A different angle is given to it so that now we can understand through what Jesus has done. We are included in that in a way that we're still kind of kept at distance from God in the Old Testament. Because again, none of these people offering sacrifices get the chance to go all the way into the inner sanctum, beyond the inner veil, and see God there. And even Aaron, when he gets that chance, and every high priest after him, for as long as God's glory actually filled that space, they don't even get to see that, because part of what will happen, which we'll discuss the next time we're together, is when they go beyond that veil, offering up the incense that they do is to create something of a screen between them and God so that they cannot see God's glory. And the assumption would be because perhaps even then, if they didn't, that they might die, right? And we've always heard that's the looming fear, hence the concept that's completely outside the Bible, that they have to have a rope tied to their leg just in case they stop moving and the bells at the bottom of their garment stop jingling. The assumption would be they've died. Nobody can go in and retrieve the body. They have to be pulled out of there. But anyway, point being is that now per the writer of Hebrews, we can walk boldly into the throne room. We don't have to be careful in the sense that we're afraid we haven't been properly atoned, and by virtue of that, our sin may cause God's holiness to break out against us. We have been perfectly purged in every way. So a long way to go through answering that question, but just trying to help us understand the reason why I pointed any of that out was just to show us there's a lot of influence in Leviticus in the New Testament we just don't pick up on and realize, and it can even be in a single word like that. So perhaps we would have to refer back to last week's lesson as it's been posted and remember the words I said there because I don't. Anyway, all right, so moving on. Before we get to what the heart of what we're going to be talking about tonight is, we need to understand a little bit more of the construct of the several chapters that intervene between the end of Exodus, where we leave off in chapter 40, and where we are now. To make sense of that, and I only bring attention to what's in Exodus 29 because where we will start tonight in Leviticus 8 is the consecration of Aaron, which this is the first place this is mentioned. And if you transpose both of these chapters side by side, you almost get a verbatim drill down of what's happened. In Exodus 29, it's God telling Moses to do this. In Leviticus 8, it's Moses putting this into action. And it's just changing a few words around to show that now it's moved into the present tense and no longer future from the standpoint of Exodus 29. But Moses is up on the mountain, Aaron down in the camp below. As that moment is transpiring, he's getting the instructions for this. Then, several chapters later, Exodus 37 through 38, we're actually in the process now of those two consecrated servants, Bezalel, Aholiab, the ones filled with the Spirit, to have and possess and execute the wisdom necessary to craft these instruments, are going through that. So now all the pieces are assembled. Then in Exodus 39, the priestly garments are listed for us. So if you just think about that, tabernacle pieces, then priestly garments, given in that order. Then we jump into Exodus 40. As Moses has been told where these pieces are going to be situated, the time has come. First day, first month, second year, put it all together. So he starts with the innermost sanctum, moves all the way out, puts the courtyard together with the linen curtains, and then once it's all fashioned, in Exodus 40, we can break this down into two parts. Really, the front half of that is Moses being told, put it all together, and then consecrate Aaron and his sons the way you were told in Exodus 29. But God jumps on the scene and becomes the show stealer, basically, after he assembles the entire tabernacle and outer courtyard. Once he puts that together, then God fills the space with his glory. The tent of meeting, which remember, that's the rectangular structure on the inside, not the courtyard. God has filled that space. Aaron and Moses cannot go in. Exodus 33, Moses had put up a tent. He gets to go there anytime. God never stops him. Now, not even he can go into this space. And the question no doubt looms large, why is that? And how does one get in there? Then we go through the process of what we just talked about last week. Leviticus chapters 1 through 7, and all of these sacrifices and the purpose behind them serve as a big part of the key that will unlock the gate, if you will, to allow them in. God gives this to Moses. I won't say at that particular moment necessarily, but it's given to us narratively to help lead up to this crescendo that comes in Leviticus 8 and 9, with God telling the people, this is how you are going to enter into my presence, how I'm going to allow you to enter into my presence. In whatever tangible way it was apparent that Moses and Aaron could not go into the tent of meeting, now the people are to understand this is how you will be accepted when you come in front of me, and that is what I intend, because that's what the purpose and function of this thing is. We're going to start using some different phrases. We've used them already, but I'm going to start using Hebrew terms also to distinguish them, because this structure here, you've heard me call it tabernacle, which in Hebrew is mishkan, and that is to signify a dwelling place. And this is what God wants. He wants to dwell amongst his people. He wants a dwelling place. But there is also the tent of meeting. And remember, in Exodus 33, that's just some tent set up out here. Now, this is henceforth and forevermore going to be the Ohel Moed. They are one and the same, but the two different terms describe two different functions. For God to dwell in the house is one thing, but for God to purpose to want to meet with who? You don't meet with yourself anywhere. If you're going to meet with someone, the intent is that there's going to be a party here, not in the celebration hurrah kind of sense, could be, but it's the idea that more than one person is going to gather. And in this case, it may be, depending upon the appointed time, a person, and it may be the idea of everybody. If we're talking about the gathered assembly around this structure, that's its purpose. And so when we get to the brink of Leviticus 8, remember, 37 through 38 of Exodus, then 39, tabernacle pieces, the most important holy objects. Then the priestly garments are fashioned. Then Moses puts all the holy objects in their position of function, and now it's time to clad the people who are going to be consecrated to go into this space and minister amongst these holy objects. It's just following the same pattern, all right? So if we kind of understand that, the idea of what's been put in there and what's about to happen next, then we'll appreciate more all this business here. All right, so let's jump into Leviticus 8. We're going to read the first 13 verses there, and then we're going to jump down to the bottom of the chapter. So the Lord spoke to Moses, "Take Aaron, his sons with him, the garments, the anointing oil, the bull of the sin offering, the 2 rams, and the basket of unleavened bread, and assemble the whole community at the entrance to the tent of meeting." So Moses did as the Lord commanded him, and the community assembled at the entrance to the tent of meeting. Moses said to them, "This is what the Lord has commanded to be done." Then Moses presented Aaron and his sons and washed them with water. He put the tunic on Aaron, wrapped the sash around him, clothed him with the robe, put the ephod on him, put the woven band of the ephod around him, fastened it to him. Then he put on the breastpiece on him and placed the Urim and the Thummim into the breastpiece. He also put the turban on his head, placed the gold medallion, the holy diadem, so it's a crown, on the front of the turban, as the Lord had commanded Moses. Then Moses took the anointing oil and anointed the tabernacle and everything in it to consecrate them. Just as a side note here, every time we read that Moses did something like this, we shouldn't always assume, because this is, in certain cases, a hefty amount of work, that he did it all by himself. He gets the credit, and of course this is important too when you jump into places like the early portion of Deuteronomy, and Moses is recounting what happened up on the mountain. In the first 40-day stint, when on the 40th day, that's the way he presents this, the event of Exodus 32 transpired, the rebellion of the gold calf. He comes down, he breaks the tablets, then he goes back up to the Lord for another 40 days. He says he chiseled out 2 tablets, which is what we see reflected in Exodus, but he also says he made an ark to put them in. Well, who made the ark? Did he make the ark, or was it the 2 craftsmen that God had appointed to make it? You could see that as a contradiction in Scripture, but who was it that gave the instruction to those men? It was Moses. The same can be said with respect to what we'll see in a week or so with respect to the Day of Atonement. We could picture it as Aaron being the one who was actually slicing and dicing, draining blood and manipulating blood everywhere it needs to be on the Day of Atonement, or he is the one that is certainly by himself carrying it in to where he alone is allowed to go. But when it comes to making the sacrifices, it's entirely possible he is not alone in doing that, that others are assisting him and he is just merely getting the credit for doing that. And it wouldn't be wrong to think so. In fact, it probably would make more sense of the text in some cases. I would imagine if Moses was the only one in Exodus 40 putting the tabernacle together, that would have been an all-day, multiple-day affair if you consider the dimensionality of it all and all the pieces, from tent pegs to positioning forks and spoons and bowls. Too much for one person to do, right? Anyway, so he sprinkled some of the oil on the altar 7 times, anointing the altar with its utensils and the basin with its stand to consecrate them. Verse 12, he poured some oil on the head of Aaron and anointed and consecrated him. Then Moses presented Aaron's sons, clothed them with the tunics, wrapped sashes around them, fastened headbands on them, as the Lord had commanded Moses. Remember, their garments are pretty much just simple linen, so not as elaborate as Aaron's. And then down in verses 30 through 36, then Moses took some of the anointing oil, some of the blood that was on the altar, and sprinkled them on Aaron and his garments, as well as on his sons and their garments. Remember that. He took blood and oil and sprinkled on them. That will make sense later why I said that, because we will reference it yet again for a completely different purpose. In this way, he consecrated Aaron and his garments, as well as his sons and their garments. Moses said to Aaron and his sons, boil the meat at the entrance to the tent of meeting, eat it there with the bread as in the basket for the ordination offering as I commanded. Aaron and his sons are to eat it. Burn up what remains of the meat and bread. Do not go outside the entrance of the tent of meeting for 7 days until the time your days of ordination are complete, because it will take 7 days to ordain you. The Lord commanded what has been done today in order to make atonement for you. You must remain at the entrance to the tent of meeting day and night for 7 days and keep the Lord's charge so that you will not die, for this is what was commanded. So Aaron and his sons did everything the Lord had commanded through Moses. So we have the offerings, and I'm using mostly in a lot of these cases Hebrew terms. I'll try to be mindful as often as I can to spell out what that is, but hopefully if I use it enough, you kind of get used to what that term means, okay? So a bull is given on his part for a chata, a sin, but also purification offering, correct? It goes without saying, no doubt, Aaron is a sinner like everyone else is, but as we talked about last week, the concept of how that blood is used in not just the sense of a person who offers said sin offering is having that blood spilled. It's not just for the sake of that blood being used for atonement in the sense that we might think of. In most cases, it's not the way we think of. The imagery that we might use is the idea that my sin needs to be atoned and therefore I need to be cleansed. But as we walked through the steps of that offering, at no point did any of us see blood coming from that animal being used to sprinkle the guilty sinner. The person is not being cleansed in that ritualistic manner. What is happening as blood is being manipulated, it is being used to anoint various holy objects, depending upon who it is that has sinned. And remember, the chapter itself opens up with the phrase and says it numerous times throughout chapter 4 of Leviticus. The sin that is called into question here are unintentional sins. So it's possible that some sin may have been committed out of error, and of course the person may be unwitting or unknowing of it. And if that is the case, if maybe out of a sense of conviction, or in this case, because of ritualistic cultic obligation, they are required to offer said sacrifice. This is a requirement from Aaron. The next person who comes after him, presumably was going to be Nadab, but as we'll see tonight, is not going to be. Eleazar is the next one who's going to take on this office. Even though the clothes are put on him while out in the wilderness when Aaron dies on Mount Hor and then is laid to rest, presumably he would have went through an ordination ceremony just like this, though we have no record of it. And every subsequent Levitical high priest, when a tabernacle or temple was functioning, to help keep the legitimacy of this alive. So a chata, to purify, is given. Then 2 tamim, which we remember are unblemished rams, are offered up. One for a burnt offering, one for, or an olah, and then one for a consecration or milu offering, all right? And then, of course, with that, a basket of unleavened bread in various forms. There are cakes with oil, there are wafers with oil. So the whole procedure, we talked about it there at length, but just to break it down in a more simplistic fashion, Moses washes Aaron and his sons with water. We're not to presume that they're necessarily standing there completely nude. They're clothed in some fashion, but probably in a more minimalistic fashion and just strictly linen garments, if anything. Perhaps they were washed behind a screen or something like that. We don't know. But most of this procedure is done for the viewing public to see. Then Moses assembles Aaron's ensemble on him. Think about it the same way that Moses is positioning all the pieces of the furniture in the tabernacle. His brother standing here as scantily clad as would be allowable and not shaming him, and then taking each of the pieces in the way he is supposed to, starting from innermost to outermost garments, and then leaving the crown for the end of it all. Then Moses does not take the opportunity to anoint his brother. He stops here. Remember, Exodus 40. He assembled the tabernacle. God's glory descends. They can't go in. Now Moses has taken his brother, washed him and his sons, put the holy garments on Aaron. He has not done so for his sons yet. He stops here to go back to the tabernacle, using oil, anoints all the objects, and Aaron. So in including Aaron along with the holy objects, what are we to see this whole procedure as? A continuum. That Aaron is part of the holy objects inside the actual tabernacle structure. He is considered to be a part of that. Without him in there, without an Adam functioning in the garden, all of this is useless and incomplete. Make sense? So he is now considered to be a part of that in a way that no one else can be. Then Moses slaughters the purification offering, the chatah. And notice on the right side of the screen there, I've used Moses wayat, the altar of burnt offering. Now what that means is, this is why a lot of us would probably stink as Hebrew scholars, because it's no doubt a difficult language to learn. But the root word in that word is kata. It's the same word that I've given to you in the block that connects to it above that. Moses is purifying the altar, kataing the altar. It causes us then, as I said last week, to broaden our understanding of what is given to us derivatively in English as sin offering. Because when we jump into that context and we read sin offering, we're thinking, all my sin in the idea of sin offering. We have to walk that through the idea of unintentional sin. And then in Hebrew, looking at the word kata as the root for a word like wayat there, and seeing that that is exactly what Moses is doing in the inverse of that by purifying the altar. How is that possible? We brought that question up last week. It's important for us to understand there's more at play here than just sin. It's the idea of purification and purification of holy objects. All right? Holy objects, and in certain cases, even people when it comes to unintentional sin. All right, moving on. Moses then splatters the blood of the kata, and in doing so, he atones for the altar of burnt offering. So in case you don't see how I'm tracking this here, I'm reading this, and then I'm going down here, all right? So then Moses offers the olah of the ram. Remember, olah, burnt offering. And we talked about last week how this could suggest, and seemingly does so very strongly amongst many scholars, the idea of the person identifying with the animal and in a sense becoming one in this mystical way, both sharing the breath of life, and this vicarious substitution on the part of the animal taking the place of the offerer to ascend to the mountain of the Lord. That's the idea, because the summit of this is where this is, where God's presence is. That there, all right? And seeing the courtyard here as being the barrier way down below. It's getting to that place, okay? Moses offers the ram of the milieu, which is consecration, and in doing so, Moses applies the blood then to Aaron. But notice how he does this. He does it to the ear, the thumb, the toe, all on the right side. But where else have we seen, and I already answered this question before, so again, not a trick question. Where else have we seen a ceremony in which an animal was killed, and by virtue of that, its blood purposefully manipulated and placed in a certain area, then said animal eaten by the offerers, because a sin offering can be eaten by the offerers, and then part of that as a fellowship meal with the Lord and with each other. All of that, of course, coupled with unleavened bread. What other context have we seen that in? Passover. So how do we make the connection here between this and Passover? What does that mean? Again, the idea is that Passover ends the exile outside of God's intended place for his people. It ends the exile and allows almost instantaneously the exodus leaving from Egypt to begin. We realize there's going to be an interlude before they finally get into the land. But when that time comes, that's what's going to happen, is eventually they are going to wind up in that space. Okay, well, let's rewind the entire story of the Bible so far. When God begins creation, he culminates it with the final act of making the only creatures who bear his image in the man and the woman. Then in chapter 2, he puts them in sacred space. He gives them a special job, not only in ruling and subduing, but guarding, watching, keeping. All that stuff. Then in chapter 3, what happens? They sin, and with that, do they stay in the garden? Do they stay in sacred space? They get kicked out. At any point in the story, though there have been hints in certain moments in the narrative and places where we see semblances of the garden kind of being reconstructed, but have we seen anything on the level of the Garden of Eden until we have gotten to the tabernacle between Genesis 3 and the beginning of Leviticus? Have we seen anything like that? That even remotely smacks of, oh, we've got an operative garden here and a new Adam figure that can walk in God's presence. Have we seen anything like that until now in any of the stories of Abraham or anybody like that? No, we have not seen that. Nothing like this, where we have an actual sacred space with a consecrated Adam who gets to go in and be in God's presence. And so because we've had none of that, if man descends from Adam, then you can say that man has been in a state of what from the garden until now? And so because we have a newly consecrated Adam in a newly furbished garden who can go in and represent, as Adam was supposed to, creation before God and God before creation, then we can say, in an effective sense, the exile from the garden has now shifted into what phase? Exiles eventually move into what? An exodus, leading back into the sacred space that starts right now kind of small in the footprint of a nation and is meant to eventually lead to being open for all the nations. Remember the words of Isaiah, my house is to be a house of prayer for all nations. What house do you think he's talking about? That. And who else says those very same words? It's the idea. And when he speaks of his own body being the temple, it's all that wrapped up into it with respect to that theme of exile. So does that make sense as goes why we see some of these repeated patterns in the way that blood is applied to Aaron? Okay. Then Aaron presents the organs, the thigh, and the bread. And of course, he waves it before the Lord. Now, it's not necessarily said of everything. Explicitly, the grain offering or the minha offering. But if a priest gives a minha offering, if one was given on the part of somebody else, he gets to eat a part of the minha offering. But when he gives it, the grain offering, it becomes a what? A burnt offering. It becomes an olah because he offers it and nobody else, because he's God's representative taking it on the part of God. But he can't do that if he's the one giving it on his own behalf. The same can be said here because all of these things are given to him. Normally, he would get a portion of the sin offering or the khatah. Normally, he would get a piece too, perhaps, of not a burnt offering but a fellowship offering, but he doesn't here. If he's giving it himself, offering on his own part, and combining it with a grain offering, the assumption would be is that it's all becoming an olah at this point. All right. Then Moses sprinkles the priests with blood and oil. They stay in the tent for 7, or the Ohel Moed. More often now is this term being used than Mishkan, because the idea is that in this cultic sense, God is looking to open the way now. That's what he's been purposefully establishing as we've been walking from Leviticus 1 through 7, now adding on the context of 8 to this, opening the way for people to come and fellowship in his presence, beginning with the consecrated Adam figure in Aaron, meeting in this place. And it's going to be for 7 days. Why do you think it's going to be for 7 days? When we meet the first garden and the first Adam figure, all of that transpires in a period of... So do you think this kind of creates a direct arc, a tangent back to that creation prologue? Absolutely. Absolutely. And so again, as I have tried to help you in previous weeks understand, if we're thinking through patterns, next comes implications, and then the idea of anticipation, what comes next. The idea was fill this space with image bearers, spread this whole thing out, if the original prologue of Scripture had not been thwarted by the events of Genesis 3. Now that we're kind of restarting that, the idea is carrying that agenda onward from one nation to the nations. All right. And now the predicament of Exodus 40, I think, has been resolved. Let's jump over to chapter 9 and read the first 7 verses. On the 8th day, Moses summoned Aaron, his sons, and the elders of Israel. He said to Aaron, take a young bull for a sin offering and a ram for a burnt offering, both without blemish, and present them before the Lord. Tell the Israelites, take a male goat for a sin offering, a calf and a lamb, male yearlings without blemish, for a burnt offering, an ox and a ram for a fellowship offering to sacrifice before the Lord, and a grain offering mixed with oil. For today, the Lord is going to appear to you. Get that. We've got a full-on theophany about to transpire here, all right? The same way that it did kind of in Exodus 19 and at other spots throughout Exodus as well. He is going to appear to you. And we should be thinking, this is why Hebrew is so important, because the way this word is phrased or structured in Hebrew, it's the idea of like me walking through the door, a physical appearance before you. So in whatever way that's going to happen, and that physical doesn't have to mean in a humanoid form. It's the idea of something physical, tangible to see. They brought what Moses had commanded to the front of the tent of meeting. The whole community came forward and stood before the Lord. Moses says, "This is what the Lord commanded you to do, and the glory of the Lord may appear to you." Then Moses said to Aaron, "Approach the altar and sacrifice your sin offering, your burnt offering. Make atonement for yourself and the people. Sacrifice the people's offering and make atonement for them as the Lord commanded." Jump with me down to verse 22 through 24. Then, after it was all said and done, Aaron lifted up his hands toward the people, blessed them. He came down after sacrificing the sin offering, the burnt offering, the fellowship offering. Moses and Aaron then entered the tent of meeting. When they came out, he blessed the people, and the glory of the Lord appeared to all the people. Fire came down from heaven, consumed the burnt offering, fat portions on the altar. And when all the people saw it, they shouted and they fell face down. So, as it says, let's bring it all together. Starting from the left side, Aaron presents a chatah, a sin or purification offering, and olah, burnt offering. All right. Here's the question, though, that's somewhat enigmatic. They've been in the tent for 7 days. They had these offerings offered at the time of their ordination, consecration, whatever you want to call that. And then atonement offerings are being given for all 7 days while they're in there. One might think that Aaron's sin has been amply atoned for at this point if we're thinking strictly in the idea of moral sin, if that's all that our definition of sin is going to encompass. So if atonement has been made every single day with a bull being sacrificed every single day and to atone for the altar as well, so we're thinking about that concept, then what would be the point of spilling blood of another innocent animal on the 8th day? It's not like a whole month gets to intervene now from the time of his ordination being complete until we get to this ceremony. It literally is the very next day after the end of this 7-day period. There's something else at play here with respect to the idea of what this chatah and this olah, which oftentimes both are coupled together. We'll see that sequence several times in the pairing of these terms, and not just here, but sometimes being used by a psalmist or a prophet, usually speaking negatively about how Israel has failed, even though they've offered these offerings, and how the Lord now disdains them, or how they want to, from a penitent heart, bring these things to the Lord and for them to be acceptable in His sight. And sometimes just for the sake of the narrative and development and the way that Samuel or a prophet or somebody like that might be offering these offerings together. So he's doing that. And of course, this requires, as it usually does for a person of his status, tamim, bull and ram, unblemished. And so now, with this, Aaron is purified, hence the kata, and he can ascend the mountain of Yahweh. All right, but he's not the only one here. He's the consecrated Adam figure, but what about everybody else? Because now it's a whole assembly. The people have way more because they have to offer a kata, an olah, a minha, a grain offering. And they, of course, are broken down into the forms of a tamim, unblemished, goat, calf, lamb, and unleavened bread, because it's a grain offering as well. And with all of this together, considering the kata and the olah, and the grain offering, inviting God to share in this with them, because this is a meal. These are food offerings, aromas pleasing unto the Lord. Israel, the whole assembly, offered on their part by Aaron, their consecrated Adam figure, they are purified. And with the idea of the olah, burnt offering, they get to ascend the mountain of Yahweh. We get that? The whole group, nation together, now gets to ascend unto the mountain of the Lord through this cultic ritual. And then, it doesn't stop there, one more offering. He offers the people's shalem, or fellowship. Some translations, usually King James, will say peace offering. That is the ox and the ram. Both parties now, because the shalem is an invitation or a greeting offering saying, please enter into the space. How many times will you encounter words like this in the Psalms that say something like, when we go into the house of the Lord, we are satiated by His bounty, His goodness. In their mind, what is the house of the Lord? It's this which is patterned off what exists there in His realm. That is meant to actually be something of a semblance of God's holy mountain, which He rules from there over the cosmos, represented here on earth by this structure. And the idea is, as an Ohel Moed, a tent of meeting, it's where they get to come and dine at the table of the king. So we're seeing this as blood being spilled and sins being forgiven in this whole Jesus forgives me of my sin construct, which is an extremely narrow-minded view of how you're supposed to look at this. Because this, I love my man Warren in the way he'll often ask, How would they have understood that back then? Or how much of that did they understand? Certainly, they're not thinking of Messiah in any of this. No way, shape, or form when Moses is giving this instruction. They're thinking this is the way that we get to go in and experience God's presence as close as He will allow us to. The purpose of Him interfering as He does in Exodus 40 is to show, and this becomes all the more important in the next chapter with what happens to Aaron's two sons, God will be regarded as holy, and they need to understand that. And there is a process, protocol that has to be observed in order for Him to find them acceptable and for them to have the greeting to come into His presence. So offering the shalem, that very word becomes the root word for words like shalom, and for Jerusalem, the idea of it being the city of peace. It's a peace offering, hence translated that way in the King James, but it's not waving a white flag, hey, ceasing of all hostilities here, no firing anymore, we want to make peace. It's the idea of friends greeting one another and gathering for the sake of fellowship. That's what this is about, okay? And I allude to Exodus 24 because, in a sense, this is what we get. When you think about why in the world in Exodus 24 does Moses get called up the mountain, that kind of makes sense, right? But what about this other group of people? Why does Aaron and his force or his two oldest sons get called up the mountain? Presumably one of those is going to be his successor. And then the elders of the people, they all represent the people, get to go up the mountain. And when they go up the mountain, what do they experience? But they see the Lord in this humanoid figure, or as this humanoid figure, kind of on this sapphire glass plane above them, and they get to sit down and eat a meal in His presence. We don't have any idea what they talked about, what else transpired. It's just a weird little factoid in the story, and they move on because then Moses stays around for a lot longer while they all go down. But it's foreshadowing what's supposed to happen here, because where does that happen? Here they are out Mount Sinai, and these people get to go up the mountain. Who is on the mountain? God, fire and smoke. Then a person comes to sit with them and eat. What is this supposed to represent? The cultic mountain of the Lord. Now, the consecrated Adam figure and the people all get to ascend into His presence like that company did and sit down and get to have a meal with the Lord. Does that make sense? Now, bringing it all together a little bit more, because it doesn't conclude there. Aaron comes out, he lifts his hands, he blesses the people, and this is supposed to be what we see in Numbers chapter 6. Now, you might be thinking the way that we read the Bible chronologically, well, we haven't gotten there yet. God hasn't told him that. Well, we will cover this later on also, but just to steal a little thunder from that, Numbers chapters 1 through 10, all of that's transpiring while they're still at Mount Sinai. In fact, it's on the first day of the first month that Moses assembles this tabernacle, consecrates Aaron. It's in the book of Numbers, though, they celebrate the second Passover on the 14th day of the second month. So it's all in the confines of that very small space of time. And it's in number 6, that concourse in which this adage is being given when the high priest blesses the people. He's supposed to say, may the Lord bless you, keep you, may He make His face shine upon you. But what does that mean? The idea of His face shining upon you in the same way that God said, my presence will go with you. That literally means my face will go with you. Moses said, you haven't told me who you're going to send. I will send my angel. That seemed like a real physical presence that's going to be leading them into the land and going with Moses and speaking about that. So if that's the case, when Moses or Aaron is lifting his hands up and saying, may the Lord's face shine upon you, the idea is that this is a theonotic blessing. It's blessing the people by saying you have been drawn into God's presence to experience Him in a dynamic way. That is what this is supposed to be, okay? And then he and Moses enter the Ohel Moed, the tent of meeting. They come out, they jointly bless the people, which in a big way kind of repeats what happens in Exodus 33. In Exodus 33, Moses makes the tent outside the camp. People get into the rhythm of watching him go out there, and they all start watching as he walks by. Yep, he's going into the tent. And when he gets out there and the cloud descends on the tent and God is speaking with him in the Ohel Moed, these people bow down. They begin to prostrate, genuflect, worship because God is speaking with this man, this consecrated Adam figure that's getting to go in there and share this moment and then come out and tell them what God has said. Now that Ohel Moed has gone away because this is the Ohel Moed. And now to signify that, The problem of Exodus 40, God showing up and they can't go in, has been resolved because the consecrated Adam figure of Aaron is now in there. Jointly with Moses, they kind of work together in tandem. This is the only time that happens in the history of the high priest. Just as a quick 30-second little side note on that, there's a deeply inspired and very serious and at the same time interesting conversation about the prospect of perhaps Aaron never meaning to be the person who played that role, and all along it was supposed to be just Moses. But God capitulated because Moses' insistence on him not going, and he makes the allowance that Aaron will jointly accompany him in all of this. Both are Levites, father or sons of the same father. He could have easily fallen into that role just as much as Aaron could, but that aside, both of them working together here and then coming out and offering a blessing, perhaps the very same thing, which is perhaps what Moses did every time he comes out of the tent in Exodus 33 until this one is finished. Then fire from heaven consumes the offerings, and that kind of repeats the idea of God's glory cloud coming down to meet Moses at the Ohel Moed, the tent outside the camp, whenever he went there. Going back to Exodus 24, when Moses went up the mountain, the cloud covered it. The glory of the Lord settled on Mount Sinai. The cloud covered it for 6 days. On the seventh day, he called to Moses from the cloud. The appearance of the Lord's glory to the Israelites was like a consuming fire on the mountaintop. So the theophany continues in Exodus 24, because after the rest of that party leaves, Moses hangs out here for 6 whole days while God descends on the mountain in some other way that he hasn't. The cloud covers it in such a way that it becomes an invitation for Moses to go into God's space, and it appears to the people at the base of the mountain like a consuming fire. What are they seeing happening here as God's presence has now filled the tabernacle space? Offerings are made. Consuming fire literally does interact with these offerings and, takes care of business on the altar. So it's just replaying patterns that have already been laid down. I don't think most of us have ever been trained to make the connections between what has already been played out in a dress rehearsal fashion in Exodus is now being the legit real deal of what's happening in Exodus. So, does that make sense? I'm sorry, in Leviticus, yes, thankfully. Somebody was keeping tabs on that. All right. Now in chapter 10, we have some trouble brewing in the garden. So let's read the first 11 verses of chapter 10 as soon as I wet my whistle. Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, each took his own fire pan, put fire in it, placed incense on it, presented unauthorized fire before the Lord, which he had not commanded them to do. Then fire came from the Lord and consumed them. They died before the Lord. Moses said to Aaron, "This is what the Lord has spoken." This little poem here that is meant to be understood and no doubt memorized by perhaps everyone, but definitely the priests. "I will demonstrate my holiness to those who are near me." Or perhaps another way of translating this might be, "I will be kept holy by those who are near me, and I will reveal my glory, or I will be glorified by those or before all people." And Aaron remained silent. Moses summoned Mishael and Elzaphan, sons of Aaron's uncle Uzziel, and said to them, "Come here and carry your relatives away from in front of the sanctuary to a place outside the camp." Now notice that chances are they probably went into the inner sanctum, and if they are outside the sanctuary, that means they're here. So when fire breached out from here, assuming that's where it came from, that they were able to make it out to here, but then fell down and then died. Moses said to Aaron and his sons Eleazar and Ithamar, "Do not let your hair hang loose, do not tear your clothes, or else you will die, and the Lord will become angry with the whole community. However, your brothers, the whole house of Israel, may weep over the fire the Lord has caused. You must not go outside the entrance to the tent of meeting, or you will die, for the Lord's anointing oil is on you." So they did as Moses said. The Lord spoke to Aaron, "You and your sons are not to drink wine or beer when you enter the tent of meeting, or else you will die. This is a permanent statute throughout your generations. You must distinguish between the holy and the common, and the clean and the unclean, and teach the Israelites all the statutes that the Lord has given to them through Moses." So one way to break this down, as we've seen through the corridor of chapter 8 and even a little bit of 9 there, 7 times in chapter 8 we have this phrase, which to us we typically gloss over, "as the Lord," or "as Yahweh commanded." Moses assembled the people for the consecrative ceremony of Aaron and his sons, as the Lord commanded. He clothes Aaron with priestly garb, as the Lord commanded. Moses clothes his sons, on and on. And I don't think it's coincidence that we have, styled by Moses, 7 distinct uses of that phrase before the 7-day period that they're inside the tabernacle, or near the opening to the tent of meeting. That being said, after the seventh day, we get one more formulation of this. On the eighth day, when now this whole assembly of Aaron and the people, Aaron getting to come out and then offer on the part of the people to join them all together to ascend to the mountain of Yahweh. One more use of as the Lord commanded. So the idea would be when things are done appropriately, because God painstakingly gave exquisite detail as to how this is to transpire, all the pieces put in play, and then what is to be conducted afterward with exact specification per chapters 1 through 7 on how these animals are to be cut, blood manipulated, and of course organs handled and everything given to God as is appropriate, and what the priests are allowed to partake of, but also in a paradoxically obligatory way required to partake of because of who they represent and the position and role they play. When all of this is done appropriately, it creates the way that's open now, because God has opened the way for humanity to enter into God's presence. We see that because God approves of this with consuming fire. A theophany occurs. He demonstrates His approval by showing up in the way that He promised. The glory of Yahweh then appears to the people. They all shout with thunderous praise as they prostrate themselves before the Lord. But what God had not commanded was for priests other than the one required or allowed to offer fire and incense in the way that they do. We could split hairs all day long, as no doubt we love to get into these little gray areas in the Bible and try to tease out, well, what was it that Nadab and Abihu did that angered God? So that could dominate the rest of our time and a whole separate conversation outside of this. But suffice it to say, there certainly seems to be enough biblical evidence as you parallel what they did with the events of what's described on the Day of Atonement in Leviticus 16. Because on that day, certain offerings are to be made, and then when those offerings are made, the person who is required takes the blood into the innermost sanctum. But they're not just walking past that veil with blood. Before they do that, they have to make one last stop at the altar of incense. Take a fire pan, put coals and incense, and when those coals and incense mingle together, it creates this thick cloud of perfume that when he walks beyond that veil, he lays it before the Ark of the Covenant. And again, as I said, creates something of a smoke screen between him and God. That seems to be what these two boys are attempting to try to do, because they are taking a fire pan, they are putting fire and incense in it. Now, of course, the term strange fire, enigmatic as it is, could mean all sorts of things. Could mean they got it from a different source other than what was authorized. But the next time this is addressed in chapter 16, this is the very thing that God opens up the Day of Atonement dialogue with, or I should say monologue, with on the day that Nadab and Abihu offered strange fire before the Lord and their bodies fell. The Lord told Moses to tell Aaron, you are not to come in here anytime you want to. If you do, you will die. And then the rest of what's supposed to happen. So that seems to suggest this is what they did. And of course, maybe even with the adage of, you're not to drink beer or wine when you are in here ministering in this place, may even also suggest they could have in some way been inebriated. And by virtue of that, their mental faculties somewhat depressed by virtue of that, and they were not thinking straight, though no legislation had been given yet or Torah instruction on who goes in, when, and how. That's happening in chapter 16. That being said, when these things are done inappropriately, the violator of the instruction puts themselves obviously at grave, intense, mortal risk. Obviously, and we see how these things are paralleled against each other, as Yahweh approved with the cultic observance of what happens in chapters 8 and 9, ordination, consecration, installation of priests, making the proper sacrifices to combine the consecrated Adam, the people all coming together to ascend the mountain of Yahweh. God disapproves with fire that consumes these two men. As Yahweh was glorified before the people, he is obviously not glorified here by Nadab and Abihu. Hence the poem that's given, I will reveal my glory before all people when I am regarded as holy before all people. And as the people shouted, Aaron, paradoxically, remains silent after what was said. So we see here, Torah observed, fellowship is established in the context of chapter 9. When Torah fails to be observed, exile and death, because there is no greater form of exile other than death, is what ensues. So, perhaps what was going on with these two men, they are attempting to gain access to what was not theirs to have, maybe Yahweh beyond the veil. Evidence seems to tip very strongly in that favor. If that's the case, we should be thinking about Adam, Eve, garden, forbidden wisdom, what was not theirs to take, and when they did, obviously, exile and death ensued. Trouble in the garden. After all, where is it that they're at when this is happening? The imagery of what you see here, what is that supposed to represent and suggest? Same thing. All right, so we're midway through our slides. Any questions at this point before we jump into chapter 11 on what we're to cover there? Nothing? All right. I'm going to go past this slide. I just want to give you a pure view of what we're going to be breaking down from chapters 11 through 15. All right, so let's jump to chapter 11. We're going to read first 4 verses, then verse 8. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, "Tell the Israelites, you may eat all these kinds of land animals. You may eat any kind of animal with divided hooves that chews the cud, but among the ones that chew the cud or have divided hooves, you are not to eat these. Camels, though they chew the cud, do not have divided hooves. They are unclean for you." In verse 8, "Do not eat any of their meat or touch their carcasses. They are unclean for you." Verses 9 through 12. I'm trying to abbreviate as much of this chapter as I can to keep the names of these animals out of there. In most cases, in Hebrew, we're not even sure exactly which one correlates to what. This may be somewhat lost to us in antiquity, but what matters is that if you want to research that now, there are myriad resources that break down exactly what the Jewish kosher diet has been recognized as for the longest period of time, and will give you more information than you could ever care to read about with respect to what animals are considered clean and not. And of course, they're not exhaustively mentioned here. Verses 9 through 12. "This is what you may eat from all that is in the water. You may eat everything in the water that has fins and scales, whether in the seas or streams." This does not count sharks, so if you got excited about that kind of thing back then, sorry to bum you out. It's a super predator. Make you feel like a really supercharged dude when you get to eat shark fin soup or something like that, but sadly, sharks are not considered kosher. I know that might disappoint you, but anyway. Verse 10, "But these are to be abhorrent to you. Everything in the seas or streams that does not have fins or scales, among all the swarming things and other creatures in the water, they are to remain abhorrent to you. You must not eat any of their meat. You must abhor their carcasses. Everything in the water that does not have fins and scales will be abhorrent to you." Verses 20 through 23. "All winged insects that walk on all fours are to be abhorrent to you. But you may eat these kinds of all the winged insects that walk on all fours, those that have jointed legs above their feet or hopping on the ground. You may eat these, any kind of locust, katydid, cricket, grasshopper, take that with a grain of salt. All other winged insects that have 4 feet are to be abhorrent." I say that because your Bible may have footnotes that may help you better understand what exactly those Hebrew words were and what they convey. Verses 24 through 28. "These will make you unclean. Whoever touches their carcasses will be unclean until evening, and whoever carries any of their carcasses is to wash his clothes and will be unclean until evening. All animals that have hooves but do not have a divided hoof and do not chew the cud are unclean for you. Whoever touches them are unclean. All the 4-footed animals that walk on their paws are unclean for you. Whoever touches their carcasses will be unclean until evening, and anyone who carries their carcasses is to wash his clothes and will be unclean until evening. They are unclean for you." And lastly, verses 43 through 45. "Do not become contaminated by any creature that swarms. Do not become unclean or defiled by them. For I am the Lord your God. So you must consecrate yourselves and be holy, because I am holy." In that context, in the way that a priest belongs to the Lord, because the priest is holy by virtue of their garments and consecrative anointing, you are to be holy, which means you exclusively belong to me. That's the idea. "Be holy because I am holy. For I am the Lord your God who brought you up out of the land of Egypt to be your God. So you must be holy because I am holy." All right, so some questions. Let's try to get you guys engaged in this. Anyone who touches the dead carcass of one of these types of animals that you see here, as I've tried to break it down as generically as possible. Oh, well, before I get into that, I forgot. It's on the bottom side of those gray boxes. To try to explain this in some way that rudimentarily ties it all together. All in some way of these animals that are listed here, all in some way are associated with death. They either live in caves or tombs where things are noted to be buried. They are carnivorous predators, scavengers, which means something else has to die or they kill it or both in order for them to thrive. They are associated with underworld deities and pagan worship, like pigs often were through many of these Canaanite clans and tribes, and may have scales but are considered to be less than whole. The case of sharks. You might think that's a nice shiny piece of skin there, but it's actually very tiny microscopic scales. So you would then think, well, the shark must count, but it doesn't. There is no tool, utensil known to man, that has yet been designed that can get the scale off of sharks without mutilating the flesh. So by virtue of that, in order for you to eat it, you have to make the animal, and we have to get inside the head of the little Israelite in our brain here to understand this, because this indoctrinated into their minds over several generations makes perfect sense to them. Because you mutilate the flesh like that, the animal is now less than whole, less than the ideal way that God would have created it. And by virtue of that, it now becomes unclean to you. Make sense? Clear as mud? Got it. All right. So anyone who touches the dead carcass of one of these types of animals or creatures are unclean until evening. So why only until evening? Kind of a weird time. Boom! Starts a new day. Exactly. And we would arrive at that conclusion simply because if we are thinking about all the places that evening have been mentioned up until this point, and just simply do a search, Bible Gateway, Google, whatever you want to use, and you weed them all out, you're going to see, or I should say, march them all out. You can easily weed out ones where you're just being given an understanding of an evening came and went or whatever. You know, it's just mentioned as something of a byword and something to help make the story kind of cohesively stick together better. But then when we get way back to Genesis chapter 1, with the first formulation of how time is even to be reckoned, with evening coming before the morning, and that creates the construct of a day, that exactly as the sun sets, dusk turns into night, then eventually we see that the day begins in darkness. So the idea is that you are ceremonially unclean and relationally distant from the Lord in that concept until the day gives way to the burgeoning in of a new day. Hence the reason why the tabernacle itself, when it's oriented in the proper direction, has its opening facing the east. What happens in the east every morning? The sun rises. And all of that, of course, speaks to the idea of the light chasing the darkness back to the shadows where it belongs, creation being reborn by the very first act of what God did in the Genesis prologue, which was not separating waters or making dolphins. It was separating light from darkness by saying, "Let there be light." So anyone who carries the carcass or eats some of the meat of a clean animal that died in some other way than sacrifice, they have to wash their clothes and be unclean until evening. Why do you have to wash your clothes? Part of this was kind of sensical. You're carrying the dead carcass. But now if you eat some of the meat of a clean animal, let's say you weren't super messy about it, why do you have to wash your clothes? Taking a stab here, because this is one of those things that the gray area of documents like the Talmud and whatnot would jump in to try to commentatively answer a question like this in a way that's practical and seems to make sense, but ultimately we don't have an explicit answer from the Bible, so we can't say with 100% assurance what it means. Disinfecting the garment, blood from a dead animal, though it's clean, it's died in some way other than what is sanctioned, and by virtue of that, death has already ensued, so thereby you are unclean by touching the animal. But also practically maybe to disinfect the garment, but maybe it's an outward symbol of what is happening on the inside, because the idea of you being set apart until evening comes and then you are considered ritually clean again, the washing of the garments may some way tie into that to symbolize what that might be. By virtue of now you have taken something into your body, okay? That's the idea here. The whole concept of this is not the animals. The concept is what this begins with. You may not what with these animals? What may you not do? This chapter opens with what you are not to do or could do with these animals. Make a taco out of it. Eat it. So it's putting it into your body, right? So the idea of washing the garment is in some way perhaps reflecting what is going on the inside. Last question. If a dead animal touches something that can be rinsed with water and cleansed, it will remain unclean until evening. But if it is made of clay or mud, it must be smashed. So why must something be smashed rather than salvaged? Because clay and mud objects are porous. And so to be able to scour that out and get it out of there would be nigh to impossible, whereas it certainly could be for a metal cooking object. Those are the kind of things that we have to think about too with respect to what's going to come later on down the road when we get into the book of Numbers. Because if you're thinking about the camp, the tribes that exist here, and the different people that live between the tribes, and the tabernacle construct itself or whatnot, that creates the whole camp. There's like a big bubble around that whole thing. And when we get to a place like Numbers 31 and the battle that ensues after the ordeal of Balaam, the sorcerer, and Balak, the king of Moab, and what he's trying to get Balaam to do to curse these people, that ultimately proves successful in the end, although not through cursing, but through seducing them with Midianite women, then God sanctions a holy war against Midian. And it's pretty brutal. All the 5 kings of the Midianites are completely obliterated. They are allowed to salvage spoils, booty from war. But the things that are to come into the camp, explicit instruction is given by the priest to tell the soldiers, before you bring it into the camp, everything that can pass through fire, metal objects, and survive it, you have to put it through fire. Everything that cannot has to be scoured with water. Why? What is the intent of doing so? What are you going to make the object afterward? Clean. Why is it unclean? Because it was taken through the process of killing other people. Death is what allowed you to have that. Because it's tainted by death, it is not fit for this. So it's kind of like sanitizing it before you can pass it through the sacred bubble to get it into this, or else you don't bring it here. It's that simple. It's the same thing with respect to this. All right, chapter 12. Less reading here. I'm not going to read the entire chapter here, but at least the first 8 verses. The Lord spoke to Moses, tell the Israelites, when a woman becomes pregnant and gives birth to a male child, she will become, I'm sorry, this is only 8 verses, so it is the whole chapter, I'm sorry, as she is during the days of her menstrual impurity. The flesh of his foreskin must be circumcised on the 8th day. She will continue in purification from her bleeding for 33 days. She must not touch any holy thing or go into the sanctuary until completing her days of purification. A lady from the tribe of Judah probably wouldn't have to worry about that too much because she's not a Levite. But Levitical women can minister in the tabernacle precincts out here. Obviously, they're not going here. But is it possible you can touch holy objects? Absolutely. Because there are all kinds of things other than just these 7 big pieces. There are forks and spoons and bowls and all kinds of stuff. In what ways they got to assist, we have no idea. But if they're holy objects and she is impure, she's not to touch those things. Okay, well, she's not going to be in this place anyway during that time if it's set up. What happens if the time comes for things to be broken down? She wants to be a good wife and go help her husband pack the things up. Oh, well, I'm sorry, honey, you can't do that. You're going through your days of impurity. Okay, I got it. I won't touch anything. But what happens if she accidentally does that? Remember the context of chapter 5 of Leviticus, the idea of the guilt offering? That whole thing happens when you violate one of the holy objects. That's the construct. So there obviously are scenarios when holy objects can be violated. She's not to touch anything holy. There's all manner of scenarios that could exist in which that would happen. Verse 5. But if she gives birth to a female child, she will be unclean for 2 weeks, as she is during her menstrual impurity. She will continue in purification from her bleeding for 66 days. When her days of purification are complete, whether or for a son or daughter, she is to bring to the priest at the entrance to the tent of meeting a year-old lamb for a burnt or olah offering, and a young pigeon or a turtle dove for a katah offering. He will present them before the Lord and make atonement on her behalf. She will be clean from the discharge of her blood. This is the law for a woman giving birth, whether to a male or female. But if she doesn't have sufficient means for a sheep, she may take 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, one for a olah offering and the other for a katah offering, when the priest will make atonement on her behalf, and she will be clean. So for a male child, circumcised at 8 days, she remains impure for 33 days. She cannot touch anything holy. For a female child, obviously no circumcision, but she remains impure for 66 days. Then, because the reason she is unclean is due to the fact there is loss of life-giving fluid here, blood. That is the whole reason. Foolishly, people have attempted to try to denounce the concept of Mariolatry, the worship, if you will, and a crude way of saying it. Not saying that's not what's going on. I'm just saying this is to the point of what that exactly means with respect to Catholicism, and the idea of denouncing such is using text from the New Testament, exclusively Luke, to say that Mary obviously was a sinner because she brought a sin offering to the Lord 2 turtle doves, signifying how pure or poor they were, when the days of her purification was over with. Why would she offer a sin offering if she was sinless? Well, that in of itself makes us look stupid because we don't understand then what the context of this passage or even Leviticus 4 is talking about then. Has the woman done anything to morally offend the Lord by virtue of having a child? Don't answer that yet. We'll get into that. I'm going to ask you some questions. Why an olah? And here's a quick check on learning. What is the word olah mean? What is it translated as in English? This offering is a what? A burnt offering. Exactly. So why a burnt offering? Think about what we talked about last week, what that could mean. What is the purpose of the olah? Exactly, to ascend, because on the altar, right? Pretend that's a dead animal. We've got the smoke rising. It intends, per the Brown Driver Briggs definition of this word in that Hebrew lexical work, it expresses the ascent of the soul in worship. But why is that needed here on the part of the woman? Well, if she wants to ascend to Yahweh in worship, and of course this in a sense offers atonement, but the idea of atonement here is not to so much expiate the concept of moral sin per se, but in a sense to satisfy what God requires in order for this process of ascent to happen. Hence the concept of accepting one when they come and lay hand on head of said animal. Why is she wanting to do that? To ascend, and she can't. Why does she need to ascend to the mountain of Yahweh? Through the whole process of her giving birth, losing blood, and by virtue of that, this kind of mimics death, then she has become closer to God or further from God, ritualistically. As far as the mountain is concerned, is she higher or lower?
Because of what's happened?
Lower. And remember, outside of the mountain of the Lord, per Genesis 1 and 2, chaotic waters that once covered everything. This is complete chaos, death. She's way lower down here, but she wants to ascend. So the blood of the vicarious atoning sacrifice has to be offered for her. So the olah, because of the period of uncleanness, has caused her to be inadvertently ritually distant from the Lord. The offering would perhaps symbolize the woman giving herself back to God, because that's the idea of the whole burnt offering. No part is left behind for anybody else to partake in. She is giving herself back to the Lord as part of what we might in the Baptist world call rededication, right? Anyway, now she is able to re-enter sacred space. And the olah is not seemingly being given to expiate some sort of moral sin. Again, has the woman done anything to offend the Lord by virtue of giving birth to a child? No. We are not to assume, well, but there might have been sin over the last 9 months, and so this is the chance for her to come and have that moral sin expiated. Maybe she thought bad things and gossiped about her neighbor or whatever the case might be. This covers that. The burnt offering, as we talked about, does not seem to expiate moral sin because there's no talk of that in chapter 1. But she doesn't offer just that. She offers a katah. What is a katah offering? That word in English means what? So no, close. I'll give you props for that. You're trying. Purification, boom. And also on top of that, per chapter 4, it's a sin offering as well. So, okay, if the burnt offering isn't to catch her sin, then certainly this is, right? Well, let's think about it. Again, loss of life-giving fluid, which mimics death. If by virtue of that, if we're considering the idea of wholeness, complete soundness of body, the ideal concept of how we were designed and created, which will play a lot into future chapters we're about to read here in just a second, is what brings us closer. But death is what brings us further away from God ritualistically in this cultic setup here. She's further away from God. She's been tainted by death. Does she need to be purified of that tainting of death in order to ascend unto the Lord? Yeah, exactly. So, a katah offering because the woman needs purification. A loss of blood, akin to death. She's contaminated by death, fallen to the farthest limit of proximity. What I mean by that is think about it like this. I'm running out of room on the board. Concentric circles. This is the idea, the ideal, the center point of the target. She's down here, the farthest one can get in allowable proximity. To be down here is to be in no man's land. It's like you don't even belong anymore. You're out of it all. This is never where anybody wants to be. This is the realm of death and permanent exile. What is meant by the expression cut off from one's people in the multiple uses of that formula. All right? The blood is not applied to her. It is on the altar where the offering is given to purify her cultic connection with God, because her cultic connection with God happens right here where this altar is. This is how she communes and ascends in fellowship to the mountain of Yahweh. Make sense? Make sense? So this is the first inference of bodily discharges, exclusively childbirth. First one was about what you put into your body. Next is what happens on the outside of the body. Let's read the first 8 verses of chapter 13. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, when a person has a swelling, scab, or spot on the skin of his body, and it may be a serious disease on the skin of his body, he is to be brought to the priest Aaron or to one of his sons, the priest. The priest will examine the sore on the skin of his body. If the hair on the sore is turned white and the sore appears to be deeper than the skin of his body, it is in fact a serious skin disease. After the priest examines him, he must pronounce him unclean. But if the spot on the skin of the body is white and does not appear to be deeper than the skin, and the hair in it is not turned white, the priest will quarantine the stricken person for 7 days. The priest will then re-examine him on the seventh day. If he sees that the sore remains unchanged and is not spread on the skin, the priest will quarantine him for another 7 days. Let's just stop real quick. I didn't ask a question about this. Why do you think periods of 7 days? Do you think that makes a difference? Absolutely. It does mean something in the text. But could it have worsened in 1 day? Or could it have remained stable and unchanged for 8 days? Why not do it 8 days, 9 days, 10 days? Why 7 days? That formulaic construction is always meant to hearken back to what? Creation. What is the final act of creation? Who is created by the final act of creation? Us. And we are created perfect with soundness of health. The idea here is that you're questioning as the soundness of health has been jeopardized by virtue of what you're seeing here in the appearance of this swelling or lesion of whatever sort it might be. The idea here is that by virtue of that, given 7 days, hopefully an appearance of improvement might have undertaken, which speaks back to the idea of new creation by virtue of the fact of God allowing your body to heal. That's ultimately what it's meant to undertake. All right. Verse 6, the priest will examine him again on the 7th day. If the sore is faded and has not spread on the skin, the priest is to pronounce him clean. It is a scab. The person is to wash his clothes and will become clean. But if the scab spreads further on his skin after he has presented himself to the priest for his cleansing, he is to present himself again to the priest. The priest will examine him. If the scab is spread on the skin, then the priest must pronounce him unclean. He has a serious skin disease. Now go with me to verses 45, 46. The person who has a case of serious skin disease is to have his clothes torn, his hair hanging loose. He must cover his mouth and cry out, unclean, unclean. He will remain unclean as long as he has his disease. He is unclean. He must live alone in a place outside the camp, outside the circle. This is where you don't want to be. Nothing that they necessarily did to bring that on themselves, and it might seem unjust and somewhat unfair, but we're going to break this down. Let's pick up with verses 47 and on. If a fabric is contaminated with mildew in wool or linen fabric, in the warp or the weft or linen or wool, of linen or wool, or in a leather or anything made of leather, and if the contamination is green or red in the fabric, the leather, the warp, the weft, or any leather article, it is a mildew contamination, and it is to be shown to the priest. The priest is to examine the contamination and quarantine the contaminated fabric for 7 days. The priest is to examine the contamination on the 7th day. If it is spread in the fabric, the warp, the weft, or the leather, regardless of how it was used, the contamination is harmful mildew. It is unclean. He is to burn the fabric, the warp or weft, in wool or linen, or any fabric article, leather article, which is contaminated. Since it is harmful mildew, it must be burned. This is the law concerning a mildew contamination in wool or linen fabric, warp or weft, or any leather article, in order to pronounce it clean or unclean. Now, I'm going to also read of chapter 14, the first 20 verses. So, bear with me. The Lord spoke to Moses, this is the law concerning the person afflicted with the skin disease on the day of his cleansing. He is to be brought to the priest, who will go outside the camp and examine him. If the skin disease has disappeared from the afflicted person, the person will order that 2 live, clean birds, cedar wood, scarlet yarn, and hyssop be brought for the one who is to be cleansed. Then the priest will order that one of the birds be slaughtered over fresh water in a clay pot. He is to take the live bird together with the cedar wood, scarlet yarn, and hyssop, and dip them into the blood of the bird that was slaughtered over the fresh water. He will then sprinkle the blood 7 times on the one who is to be cleansed from the skin disease. He is pronounced him clean and release the live bird over the open countryside. The one who is to be cleansed must wash his clothes, shave off all of his hair, and bathe in water. He is clean. Afterward, he may enter the camp, but he must remain outside his tent for 7 days. Again, we would understand why that is with the 7-day expression. He is to shave off all his hair again on the 7th day, his head, his beard, his eyebrows, and the rest of his hair. He is to wash his clothes and bathe himself in water. He is clean. On the 8th day, he must take 2 unblemished male lambs, an unblemished year-old ewe lamb, a grain offering of 6 quarts of fine flour mixed with olive oil, and 1/3 of a quart of olive oil. The priest who performs the cleansing will place the person who is to be cleansed together with these offerings before the Lord at the entrance to the tent of meeting. The priest is to take 1 male lamb presented as a guilt offering, along with the 1/3 of a quart of olive oil, and he will present them as a presentation offering before the Lord. He is to slaughter the male lamb at the place of the sanctuary area where the sin offering and burnt offering are slaughtered for the sin offering. The guilt offering belongs to the priest. It is especially holy. The priest is to take some of the blood from the guilt offering, put it on the lobe of the right ear of the one to be cleansed, on the thumb of his right hand, the big toe of his foot. The priest will take some of the 1/3 quart of olive oil, pour it onto his left palm. The priest will dip his right finger into the oil in his left palm, sprinkle some of the oil with his fingers 7 times before the Lord. From the oil remaining in the palm, the priest will put some on the lobe of the right ear of the one to be cleansed, on the thumb of his right hand, the big toe of his right foot, and the top of on the blood of the guilt offering. What is left of the oil of the priest's palm is to be put on the head of the one to be cleansed. In this way, the priest will make atonement for him before the Lord. The priest is to sacrifice the sin offering and make atonement for the one to be cleansed from his uncleanness. Afterward, he will slaughter the burnt offering, and the priest is to offer the burnt offering and grain offering on the altar. The priest will make atonement for him, and he will be cleansed. I ask you to take my word for it, but verses 48 through 53, as I'm going to try to salvage some time here, speaks of the same thing with respect to the idea of a house being burdened with this kind of uncleanness, i.e. it is mildew. The priest has come in and done his thing. 7 days, let's hope it don't spread. 7 more days, maybe it won't spread again. And then if it does, hey, we got to start taking blocks out of the wall or whatever. And then if it stops and the house can ritually be declared clean, the idea is the same thing. The same exact animals and whatnot are to be used, and the same concept of sprinkling, albeit there's no ear, thumb, or finger of the house to be anointed, but the idea is blood and oil are to be sprinkled by using these birds and whatnot, and it is to be pronounced clean. And of course, we remember the idea of one bird being slaughtered, and then the bird who was dipped into that blood with everything else attached to it, and the idea might be a crossbeam and bird fastened to it using scarlet yarn by its wings, and then hyssop attached to it, also held in place by the scarlet, and then it is dipped into the blood-water mixture of the bird slaughtered in the clay pot, and then that sprinkled upon the person to ritually cleanse them or pronounce them clean. Then that bird is cut loose and let go. Let that simmer for a second. I mean, there's so many connections to Jesus. Praise God there is. But aside from that, I also want to call your attention to other things that we've already talked about. So the victim must rend his clothes, let his hair hang loose, verbally warn others of his uncleanness. Remember, at the beginning of chapter 10, when Nadab and Abihu die, what does Moses sternly and immediately warn Aaron and his surviving 2 sons not to do? Do not let your hair hang loose. Do not tear your clothes. Why? Why would they even do that? It is a sign of mourning because of death. But in this case, with the person who has the skin disease, they are not mourning a dead person outside of themselves. They are mourning themselves because in every way possible one might convey this to mean they are experiencing a living death. What is experienced on the outside of the body, which appears to be rather serious because it's termed a serious skin disease, and other slightly more archaic translations, it may say leprosy, but we should not be familiarizing that with the idea of modern-day understanding of leprosy, the concept of Hansen's disease. So many preachers have preached on that. I'm guilty of the same before I come to understand this better, in the idea that, and truly, it is a hideous disease, and it looks like the body is dying from the outside by virtue of what that disease does. Not to say that it couldn't have happened to a person, but this encompasses many other things beyond just Hansen's disease. But once this is experienced, the person is experiencing a living death. And by virtue of that, they, unlike the woman who was further down because of loss of life-giving fluid, that sense of unsoundness of the body is quickly remedied by virtue of the natural process after childbirth. And if not, then a whole new classification is assigned. But that doesn't even lend itself to this. This person is outside the camp. They are, for all intent and purposes, dead to everybody because they cannot go around anyone at all. So, when the person is pronounced unclean, we talked about what that would look like. But what procedure does this seem to mimic? Again, think in your mind. And just to give you a hint, we've not covered it yet. We're about to. But when you think about the idea of two of the same animals, one being slaughtered and blood applied, and the other one being let go, what procedure does that mimic? Yeah, of the Day of Atonement, exactly. And so what does that speak to? Again, the Day of Atonement, we have a tendency to think that's all about me and my sin being cleansed. That is not the subject of the chapter. There's still a little thunder about, or away from what we're going to talk about next time. It's all about the cleansing of sacred space. And that in and of itself is also important with respect to the other offering that is given. But before we get there, the same procedure is done for a house that has been declared tahor, or clean, from all infestation, thus purifying the house. In other words, when we see this in this concept of blood from a heavenly creature, a bird, being sprinkled on us, it's all about, Jesus, take my sins away. Yes, absolutely. That almost seems to be a little cheapened, though, in the idea that the same thing is done for a house. Why for a house? The whole corporate nation in and of itself is just one of many Lego blocks, if you will, units that are all put together that consist of individual smaller units, that is the family. Hence Deuteronomy 6, the Shema, you are to speak of these things wherever you go. The concentration is here in the house. Every unit in Israel, the family, doing its thing, and everybody by doing their thing like they're supposed to be, creates a holy nation represented by this, centered around that. So the idea would be the place where you meet and do life every day has now become a sacred space for you and your family. Not to the extent that this is, sure, but it's now a place that has been rescued, ransomed from destruction, because if this stuff spread bad enough, that's what's going to happen to your house. We're taking the wrecking ball through this baby, and it's going to be a pile of rubble when we're done, because you can't go there anymore. It is henceforth and forevermore unclean, unless it can be salvaged. Then the next offering that is given after he shaves his hair and does this whole thing about outside of his tent for 7 days, on the 8th day, all these animals sacrificed. One lamb, of course, is for an asham, a guilt offering of restoration. In other contexts, it's for restitution, giving a value of what was taken back to the person who was violated. This person was taken from God by virtue of the living death. Now they're being given back. Restitution is being offered, hence the reason this animal is given. Blood and oil is applied to the right ear, thumb, big toe, and oil on the head. A chatah, or sin offering, purification offering, is made with the other lamb, and a burnt offering, olah, with the ewe lamb. This concept of blood manipulation on the spots of the body, what procedure does this mimic? We just read it tonight. Who else had this done to them? Priests. Oh, now this is big. The priests have that so that they can get into where? Where could they not get into until they have this done? Sacred space. This guy is out here. He can't even get into the sacred bubble. But he is just as precious to God as the consecrated Adam figure who gets to go in here. And by virtue of this, this symbolizes that he even gets to go back into his house now, because he has to live in exile outside of his house for a whole week until the 8th day, the day after the Sabbath, that stretches on for the indefinite period beyond in the creative context of Genesis 1 through 2, and the idea that he now gets to enter back into that space and be a part of the community as his body has been declared sound and whole. It's as if he's a new creation again. Exile is over. Exodus for him has occurred. He is reinstalled back into the context of the covenant people of God as a priest that belongs to the kingdom of priests. I don't have time to read the first 18 verses of chapter 5, but we'll just go through this, and we'll try to talk about it in as much of a grown-up manner as we can, because we're talking about bodily discharges, but the things that happen now in rather ordinary everyday life, when men and women do what is required to make babies, and when men sometimes have natural physiologic processes that occur after they have reached that pubescent period and beyond. And of course, when women, we've already talked about what happens when they have babies, what happens when the plumbing doesn't quite work the way it's supposed to because disease may set in, and the medical remedies that are offered nowadays weren't available back then, and sadly they may have to suffer indefinitely, or it may resolve itself in a period of time. But the idea is that when stuff comes out of the sexual organs of the body that are used to make life, this is also considered a consequence that leads to uncleanness. All are in some way are associated with loss of life-giving fluid, either blood or semen. You might think, well, how is semen a life-giving fluid? It's easy to see the idea of blood because life is in the blood. I've given it to you to make atonement on the altar, right? That's what God says in Leviticus. Well, what happens when sperm and egg combine? Life. So it is a life-giving fluid. Everything that touches him or her, in this case, or whatever they deliberately touch is considered unclean until evening. And a completion of purification requires an alah and a katah offering after 7 days, along with a bath and clothes being washed. So I don't really have to go into this too much because we've already talked about this. All I've done in these boxes is just really change the pronouns. Instead of it being her only, as it was with chapter 12, now it's he or her, depending upon the context. And that will be the same reason for giving the olah, because they are ritually unclean and separate from the Lord, loss of life-giving fluid. They want to ascend back into the mountain of the Lord and be where they can, as close in proximity to God as they can, moving outside the concentric circle toward closer to the center. While a katah, same thing, loss of life-giving fluid mimics death. They're contaminated by death, on and on. But why wash with water, and why even be considered unclean at all? I mean, for crying out loud, is this not the fruit of marriage? The one thing that we all really want to enjoy because it's the most intimate expression of man and woman becoming one flesh, as God idealized marriage in chapter 2 of the Genesis prologue. So this is not something that's shameful by no means. But again, seminal fluid, also life-giving fluid like blood, its loss does not mimic death, but the concept of the result being the possible conception of children, creating life, which is something that is a godly function. And this is the reason why, while I have not drawn attention to it until now, these last 5 slides have all been entitled the very thing that God tells Aaron at the moment his 2 oldest sons die. That you are to, and this seemingly, at least is the first time God speaks directly to Aaron. Remember, every one of these other speeches have been from Moses, all the way back to the time they're in Egypt and Pharaoh, or dealing with Pharaoh. Moses has been the one talking to Aaron. This is the first time that we have record of that God speaks directly to Aaron, and he tells him, on the saddest day of his life, your responsibility is to distinguish between the holy and the unholy, the clean and the unclean, and to teach everybody out there in all them tents to do the same thing. To create life is a godly function that cannot be treated in a common, profane manner. It has to be treated as holy. Hence, when you do this, you consider yourselves unclean, not because you've done something to be ashamed of in God's sight. And before this time, plenty of the other people in this chain of stories between Adam and these people have experienced that and never had to feel this sense of uncleanliness. Why these people now? The theocracy that they live in, that's meant to have a profound sense of impact on the world around them, and to understand that creating life, a godly function, is not as everything else that they do, from what they put in their body, on their body, how their body looks, is meant to be seen as an ideal state of wholeness or unwholeness, and what happens to be done in the gradient that exists in between to get them back into God's presence and to ascend the mountain of the Lord. All right, I actually did leave a few minutes for some questions. So, what do you have to ask? Well, I forgot the 10 minutes we were over. My clock here says an hour and 28 minutes. What are your questions?
So all the unclean, getting back to the animals, unclean, clean animals. You were saying all the unclean animals pretty much specified in Scripture, because I haven't studied this much, are animals that eat other dead things.
For the most part. In some way are scavenger, carnivorous.
Scavengers,
Yeah, exactly. Are in some way tied to death. A pig could even be seen as that. A pig will easily eat something that has blood in it. Exactly.
I mean, but then where do you stop? Because, I mean, fish has scales, but it eats worms and other stuff that's, you know.
Yeah, I was thinking about
Yeah.
that, the fish, because most fish eat other fish.
Mhm.
You know,
No, you're right. You're right.
cannibals, so.
And so the connections, in some way, seem solid and clear, but in other ways, you're right. There almost seems to be an infinite series of regressions that could take place. Hence the reason why all of the other writing that had been done by Jewish sages over the year to try to really break it down so that a person can be seen as kosher. I mean, buddy, this stuff gets nutty. You have to consider the idea of how the meat itself is prepared and stored. If it's stored in something with oil that was not prepared in the kosher manner, that too becomes a problem in and of itself.
They
So
gotta have
all
2 sinks so they can do meat and vegetables a different way.
right, hence the reason, or even the utensils. If a knife was used to cut pork, even if it was rinsed and it's used to then cut meat, if it's not cleansed in a proper kosher manner, that meat's defiled. So, buddy, to think that this was all born from that Pharisaical way of looking at how to prepare food, cleanse the body, utensils, all these things, it's a painstaking process. Hence the reason why Jewish communities have a tendency to exist as they do in a more close-knit, clustered way, because then you have those resources available in the community that have already been certified as kosher kitchens and all these other
Oh,
things.
yeah, when we went to Israel, 2 years ago, it was like that. It was separated, you know, you didn't go, most, if they were Orthodox Jews, you know, if we ran a restaurant or something, you didn't eat, it wasn't on the menu. You didn't go and open cafes or something. You did not go and sit down in one of their tables if you were eating something. They would tell you get up and leave.
Wow.
You know, it was very interesting when I went over there, the diets and everything.
I'm sure.
You know.
I am sure. Anything else? No, I'll stop there.